live in a world in which you are not going to get an objection-free solution. What you need, nonetheless, is to finally move beyond the indefinite debate, acknowledging the validity of that diagnosis, and then to find a prescription that the rest of the world can accept and will eventually learn to finally live with. So that's something that India clearly feels very strongly. There is need for an expansion of the Security Council in both categories, permanent and non-permanent. But it's not just the Security Council. We'd like to see the General Assembly strengthened as the primary intergovernmental legislative body, which it is not yet. It has become too often a rhetorical forum or a declaratory forum, rather than one which acts as a legislative body which drives the action of the UN organization. We'd like to see the Economic and Social Council of the UN becoming a more meaningful, development-oriented body and a serious instrument of development governance. And we'd like to see a greater sharpening and focus on the working of the UN funds, agencies and programs, whose effectiveness is so important for so many of the world's vulnerable and developing people. And I say this not purely as an academic exercise, but as somebody, both an Indian minister and someone who's devoted 3 decades of his life to multilateral cooperation at the UN, I say that my very big fear remains that if reform does not come, the countries may despair and lose interest in the working of the world body. There are obviously people beginning to say, why should we waste time and energy and support and political focus on a place where they will not have us at the high table when there are others that are willing to acknowledge and admit us. There are people who say that. I'm not endorsing the question. But the fact that such questions are being asked is something that I think is worrying and should be worrying to all of us interested in an effective global system. Because the G8 or G20 or whatever it's going to be in its final numbers is a body without a charter, that does not require any 2/3 votes for amendment, that does not need to be hamstrung with 18 years of debate in deciding on its composition, for example. For observers of world politics, it would be interesting to watch whether alternative structures of world government could arise and really undermine the one really effective universal organization we built up on the underpinnings of international cooperation, that is the United Nations. So not reforming and being petty and throwing obstacles up to reform would be terribly short-sighted. Not only because it does not address the fundamental problem that I described as the diagnosis, but it's also short-sighted because it could potentially undermine the very institution that many of these countries, particularly medium-sized countries that are now in the forefront of the opposition to reform because they feel they won't gain, they will undermine the institution that they are seen as the bulwark for their own security and safety and influence in the world. And that is a very serious issue. Now I do want to turn to the international financial institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, because of course we always tend to focus excessively on political institutions. Geopolitics is far more interesting to laymen, including myself, than financial institutions. But the fact that it is once again rather odd that these reflect the realities of 66 years ago. We have to add one more year to the equation because the Bretton Woods institutions were designed in 1944. Frankly, it does seem slightly absurd that a small European country should dispose of the same weighted vote as China in these institutions. And we really will need to see reform. The G20 summit in Pittsburgh last September set in motion a process for global redesign of the international financial and economic architecture. And in some ways, that was what legitimized it in the eyes of many of us as the premier forum for international economic cooperation. It's a meaningful forum. Mrs. Rai was kind enough to say that the shawl may be a bit warm for the weather today, and I said, well, these days I'm getting a chilly reception. Perhaps it wasn't the appropriate thing, but I must say the notion of being called a distinguished global thinker is quite disconcerting. It reminds me of Napoleon's famous crack about the Holy Roman Empire, that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. I fear you're giving this award to someone who is neither distinguished, no longer very global, and rarely enjoys much time to think. As I believe Groucho Marx said when presented an Oscar, I'm delighted to accept this award before you realize your mistake. I really would like to congratulate the IILM Institute for Higher Education, which has also developed over a very short period of time to be one of the major institutions of higher learning in our country, with a network of schools, colleges and institutions of higher learning in India. And I'd like to really compliment you. I'm delighted that this is probably very indiscreet of me that Anil Rai was able to mention to me as I came in that Not only were we at college at roughly the same time, he even voted for me in my first election, which happened to be for presidency of the Union there. And I do want to compliment you all for your contribution, Mrs. Rai, for the cause of quality education and training in our country. Now I'm happy to address the topic of global governance, which was what we had settled on when Ambassador Rajan and I discussed what might be useful to consider from the perspective of global thought. Global governance is something that I have worked in at the United Nations for 3 decades, but it's also, I think, a theme of compelling interest to me in my present incarnation, so I thought I'd talk about it. But global governance is not, in fact, not exactly the most precise concept dreamed up by political scientists today. It's used to describe the processes and institutions by which the world is governed. And it was always intended to be an amorphous idea, since there is no such thing as a global government to provide such governance. So global governance is a term that tries to impose a sense of order, real or imagined, on a world without an organized system of government. Now to describe it, I focus on 4 essential aspects. The first is history. The institutions of global governance today are those that emerged after the disasters of the first half of the 20th century. And I think we must never forget the past if we are to understand the present and focus on the future. In the first half of the 20th century, the world saw 2 world wars, countless civil wars, mass expulsions of populations, and the horrors of the Holocaust and Hiroshima. It was a period in which I think the world must have really wondered whether we as a collective humanity were likely to survive. Tolstoy had already written that memorable line that if you were not interested in war, it didn't matter because war was interested in you. That was what was going on to everybody, and that's what happened throughout the first half of the 20th century. Then things changed. In and after 1945, a group of far-sighted leaders were determined to make the second half of the 20th century different from the first. So they drew up rules to govern international behavior, and they founded institutions in which different nations could cooperate for the common good. That was the idea of global governance, to foster international cooperation, to elaborate consensual global norms, and to establish predictable, universally applicable rules to the benefit of all. And the keystone of the art, so to speak, was the United Nations itself. The UN was seen by the world leaders of that time as the only possible alternative to the disastrous experiences of the first half of the century. It stood for a world in which people of different nations and cultures could look on each other not as subjects of fear and suspicion, but as potential partners, able to exchange goods and ideas to their mutual benefit. The UN was seen by visionaries like former US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the only possible alternative to that kind of world history I've summarized for you. And as FDR Roosevelt stated in his historic speech to the 2 US Houses of Congress after the Yalta Conference, the UN would be the answer to the military alliances, balance of power politics, and all the arrangements that had led to war so often in the past. His successor, the US President who actually presided at the birth of the UN, Harry Truman, put it clearly, and I'll quote, "You have created a great instrument for peace and security and human progress in the world," he declared to the assembled signatories of the United Nations Charter in San Francisco on June 26, 1945. And I continue quoting, "If we fail to use it, we shall betray all those who have died in order that we might meet here in freedom and safety to create it. If we seek to use it selfishly for the advantage of any one nation or any small group of nations, we shall be equally guilty of that betrayal." We all have to recognize, Truman went on, no matter how great our strength, that we must deny ourselves the license to do always as we please. No one nation can or should expect any special privilege which harms any other nation. Unless we are all willing to pay that price, no organization for world peace can accomplish its purpose, and what a reasonable price that is. Quote, unquote, an American president of that day. Now, Truman's conviction was that the sacrifices that soldiers had made in the Second World War to create that moment in San Francisco would only be justified if you had an arrangement in which all countries felt they had an equal stake. That was a very clear and strong vision, and there's no question that the setting up of the global institutions in 1945 is something we can all look back on with a sense of admiration and, dare I say it, gratitude. Not to imply that paradise descended on earth in 1945. We all know that tyranny and warfare continued, the Cold War broke out then. Billions of people still live in the world in extreme and degrading poverty. But in fact, the overall record of the second half of the 20th century, and I'm speaking now from the perspective of the end of the first decade of the 21st, is one of amazing advances. The Third World War didn't occur. The world economy expanded as never before. There was astonishing technological progress. Many in the industrialized world came to enjoy a level of prosperity and have access to a range of experiences that their grandparents could scarcely have dreamed of. And even in the developing world, there was spectacular economic growth. Child mortality has been reduced. Literacy has spread. The peoples of the developing world threw off the yoke of colonialism, and those of the Soviet bloc won political freedom. Democracy and human rights may not yet be universal, but they are now much more the norm than the exception. Now, the second important feature I said I'd give you before is the global nature of the determining forces of today's world. There are broadly two contending and even contradictory forces in the world in which we live today. On the one hand are the forces of convergence, the increasing knitting together of the world through globalization, modern communications and trade. And on the other hand are the opposite forces of disruption, of religious polarization, of the talk of the clash of civilizations, and of terrorism. Now the two forces, one pulling us together, the other pushing us apart, are both concurrent phenomena of our times. And these are taking place in a world in which, though I may be accused of being excessively India-centered, 2611 was in many ways emblematic of this paradoxical phenomenon. Why do I say this? Because the terrorists of 2611 used the instruments of globalization and convergence, the ease of communications, GPS systems and mobile telephone technology, five-star hotels frequented by the transnational business elite, and so on, as instruments to advance their fanatical agenda. Similarly, on 9/11 in New York, rather than as forces to bring the world closer together, the terrorists also used similar tools. The jet aircraft being crashed into those towers that were so emblematic of global capitalism, while the doomed victims of the planes made frantic mobile telephone calls to their loved ones. So both 9/11 and 26/11 were grotesque moments in that way. At the same time, of course, 9/11 had already reminded us of the cliché of the global village, because it proved that we're living in a village in which a fire that started in a dusty cave somewhere in Afghanistan, in one corner of the global village, could be strong enough to melt the steel girders holding up the tallest skyscrapers at the opposite end of the global village. We have to recognize both the positive and the negative forces of the world today, and from it, a consciousness, distill a consciousness of the increasing mutual interdependence that characterizes our age. Global governance therefore rests on the realization that security is not indeed just about threats from enemy states or hostile powers, but that there are common phenomena that really cut across borders and affect us all. In fact, in my days in the UN, we used to use the phrase problems without passports. The notion that the world is full of problems that cross all frontiers, that cannot be solved by any one country or any one group of countries, however rich or powerful they may be, and which are unavoidably the shared responsibility of humankind. This idea has gained strong ground through the 90s and through the first part of this century. There's an obvious list of such problems. Terrorism itself, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, of the degradation of our common environment, of climate change. Quite obviously, because you can't put up a fence in the sky to sequester our own climate. It affects everyone. Persistent poverty and haunting hunger, human rights and human wrongs, mass illiteracy and massive displacement. There are financial and economic crises, because the financial contagion became a virus that spread from one country to others. The risk of trade protectionism, refugee movements, drug trafficking, and we must not overlook epidemic disease. Take the SARS epidemic in China. Initially there was an attempt to keep it quiet, but it was very easy for the virus to hop on a plane and show up in Toronto, and suddenly it became a global phenomenon, no longer something that could be contained in any one country. And the same was true earlier of AIDS, and later of swine flu, H1N1 today, and so on. So today, whether one is from India or from Indiana, Whether you live in Narita or in Noida, it is simply not realistic to think only in terms of one's own country. Global forces press in from every conceivable direction. People, goods and ideas cross borders and cover vast distances with ever greater frequency, speed and ease. The internet is emblematic of an era in which what happens in New York or New Caledonia, from democratic advances to deforestation to the fight against AIDS, can affect lives here in New Delhi. As has been observed about water pollution, we all live downstream. Indians therefore have a growing stake in international developments. To put it another way, the food we grow and we eat, the air we breathe, and our health, security, prosperity and quality of life are increasingly affected by what happens beyond our borders. And that means we can simply no longer afford to be indifferent about the rest of the world, however distant other countries may appear. The fourth aspect is the emergence of institutions and processes that reflect this reality of increasing global convergence. Global institutions benefit from the legitimacy that comes from their universality. Since all countries belong to it, the UN enjoys a standing in the eyes of the world that gives its collective actions and decisions a legitimacy that no individual government can enjoy beyond its own borders. But the institutions of global governance have been expanding beyond the UN itself. There are selective intergovernmental mechanisms like the G8, military alliances like NATO, sub-regional groupings like the Economic Community of West African States, one-issue alliances like the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Writers connect under International PEN, soccer players in FIFA, athletes under the International Olympic Committee, mayors in the World Organization of United Cities and Local Governments. Bankers listen to the Bank of International Settlements and businessmen to the International Accounting Standards Board. The process of regulating human activity above and beyond national boundaries has never been more widespread. Now this is occurring at a time when we have this huge list of problems with our passports that I talked about that also call for solutions that cross frontiers. Now individual countries may prefer not to deal with such problems directly or alone, but they're obviously impossible to ignore. So handling them together internationally is the obvious way of ensuring they are tackled. It's also the only way. Perhaps we can call for blueprints without borders. Some scholars of international affairs have begun to speak of an idea that they call responsible sovereignty, the notion that nations must cooperate across borders to safeguard common resources and to tackle common threats. I think that's a very sensible and succinct way of looking at the world which we have now come to, 65 years after the institutions of global governance were created, in a very different world, and in itself in a reaction to the very different world that preceded it. Now in parallel is emerging the idea that there are universally applicable norms that underpin our notion of world order. Sovereignty is one, and linked to that idea is the principle of non-interference in other countries' internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, non-aggression and coexistence across different political systems, the very principles first articulated by Pandit Nehru in his famous Panchsheel doctrine for the People's Republic of China in 1954. Today's China's foreign policy is not explicit about Panchsheel, but its principles are embedded in the Chinese concept of a harmonious world. Now, at the same time, there's evolved a new set of global norms of governance that complement these principles, including respect for human rights, transparency and accountability, rule of law, equitable development based on economic freedom, and at least to most nations, political democracy. These are seen as broadly desirable for all countries to aspire to, and while no one suggests that they can or should be imposed on any nation, fulfilling them is seen as admirable by most of the world and broadly accepted as evidence of successful governance. Now these four broad aspects are descriptive of global governance rather than prescriptive. But I would suggest that we should examine them in the context of a significant change in the way the world has evolved since the end of the Second World War. While we've all benefited, as I said earlier, from the global governance structures that evolved since 1945, we still have to recognize that these reflect the realities of 1945 and not of 2010. And that's why the time has come to think seriously about the challenges and the opportunities in global governance in the future. As we look around the world of 2010, we cannot but fail to note the increase in the number of major powers across the world since the structures of the international system were put in place in 1945. It's an undeniable fact that the emerging powers have moved very much from the periphery to the center of global discourse and global responsibility. And they have now a legitimate and an increasingly voluble desire to share power and responsibility in the global system. The dominance of a handful of small, industrialized Western countries, especially in the international financial institutions, the so-called Bretton Woods organizations, looks increasingly anomalous in a world where economic dynamism has shifted irresistibly from the West to the East. In arguing the case for more democratization of the international system, I would like to add here, parenthetically, the increasing role of what are called social forces, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, civil society movements, which we don't perhaps give enough account of in our discussion of global governance, but which we cannot be indifferent to or unconscious of. So with all of this, and with the emergence of new powers and forces which, unlike China, were omitted from the high table in 1945, we have clearly reached a point where there is a need for a system redesign of global governance to ensure that all countries benefit. Clearly what we in India are looking for is a more inclusive multilateralism, and not, as some American and Chinese observers have suggested, a G2 condominium. As an Indian, I have no doubt that we must be globally active if we are to create and maintain the society we want at home. And our success at home is the best guarantee that we will be respected and effective abroad. Because the distinction between domestic and international is less and less meaningful in today's world, when we think of foreign policy, we must also think of its domestic implications. The ultimate purpose of any country's foreign policy is to promote the security and well-being of its own people, its own citizens. We want a world that gives us the conditions of peace and security that will permit us to grow and flourish, safe from foreign depredations, but open to external opportunities. At the same time, there is a consensus in our country that India should seek to continue to contribute to international security and prosperity, to a well-ordered and equitable world, and to democratic, sustainable development for all. This we will continue to do, and we will do so in an environment in which change is the only constant. If I may be permitted the indulgence of a personal reminiscence, since you recounted in such detail my past life in introducing me, let me tell you how much my old organization, the UN, has been transformed in the career span of the one former UN official speaking to you today. If I had even suggested to my seniors when I joined the organization in 1978 that the UN would one day observe and even run elections in sovereign states, that it would conduct intrusive inspections for weapons of mass destruction, that it would impose comprehensive sanctions on the entire import-export trade of a member state, that it would create a counter-terrorism committee to monitor national actions against terrorists, or set up international criminal tribunals and coerce governments into handing over their own citizens to be tried by foreigners under international law. If I had said any of these things, I'm sure my seniors would have told me that I simply did not understand the organization I was joining, that I didn't have any idea what the United Nations was all about. And indeed, since that was the late 1970s, they might well have asked me, "Young man, what have you been smoking?" And yet the UN has done every one of those things during the last 2 decades and more. It's a reflection of how much the world around us has evolved since the era when the Cold War seemed frozen in place, borders seemed immutable, and the Soviet Union looked as if it would last forever. If all of those things could change so dramatically within one generation, shouldn't we be better prepared as a country and a society for similar changes to happen in the course of the next generation? And if so, and I say this particularly to the young students in the room, how do we want the world that will emerge to be organized? This leads me almost inevitably to UN reform, because that is perhaps the first consequence that follows from the analysis that I've given you. UN reform is sort of like a malady where all the doctors gather around the patient and they all agree on the diagnosis, but they can't agree on the prescription. And that's the problem we've been facing for the last 18 years of debate on UN reform, since the General Assembly took it on the agenda in 1992, but which we are now seeking to supplant with a more serious discussion in the General Assembly plenary. Now, the diagnosis, I would stress, is clear. There are many elements to mention, but I'll just give you 3 examples. The first is that when the UN was founded, the Security Council was 11 members out of a total membership of 51 UN members. In other words, 22% of the UN's members were in the Security Council. Today it's 15 out of a total UN membership of 192, so fewer than 8%, which means that larger numbers as well as a larger percentage of countries feel unrepresented, underrepresented, unheard in the premier institution for the maintenance of international peace and security. Second example, with all respect to Europe, a continent which I have a lot of personal affection for, the fact that Europe, with 5% of the world's population, has 33% of the seats in the Security Council every year, is frankly bizarre. That is something the rest of the world inevitably has to question. There is also the fact, the third example, that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, with their permanent positions there and their right of veto, are all there because they happen to have won a war 65 years ago. Now, when can you think of any institutional arrangement which is justified by an event of history that took place 6.5 decades ago? For all of these reasons, the diagnosis that reform is necessary is very clear. Now, I won't spend too much time today on the prescription because I think we all know that there are so many differing views on whether to reform, where to reform, how to reform, in what way, which countries to get in, because for every country that has put itself forward, there have been some other countries that have objected. I remember when the initial talk was all about Germany and Japan, the then Italian Foreign Minister, Susanna Agnelli, said, "What's all this talk about Germany and Japan? After all, we lost the war too." So Europe has its objections, and you know, the Spanish-speaking Latin American countries are sometimes less excited about Brazil, and perhaps others are. In India, we know we have a neighbor who has strongly resisted any proposal that could see us become a permanent member, and we know that Japan has similar problems with its East Asian neighbors. There are objections, but the fact is that for North-South dialogue, because the South is not completely outweighed and outvoted by the North in the composition of the G20. Now, the summit in Pittsburgh took a concrete decision to reform the financial institutions. There are going to be mechanisms for G20 experts to address regulatory reform, but there's also talk of shifting decision-making power within these organizations. A decision to shift 5% of the IMF quota share and 3% of the World Bank's voting power from the developed world to the developing and transition economies. Now, this actually falls short of what India, along with Brazil, Russia, and China, the so-called BRIC, have called for. BRIC has called for 7% of the IMF quota share, not 5%, and 6% of the World Bank's voting powers, not 3%, to be transferred. But at least it's a beginning. And our objective, frankly, in the longer term, is broad parity between the developed countries and the developing and transition economies, and so we see this only as a first step. Now, if that seems contestable to some people in the West, I think we can only point to the recent global financial crisis, which showed how important it is that the surveillance of risk by international institutions, early warning mechanisms, and so on, are needed for all. In other words, they are needed so that the developing countries can also have some oversight over the mistakes the developed countries are making as well. It's important that in this context, the developing countries should have a voice in overseeing the global financial performance of all countries, rather than it simply being a case of the rich supervising the economic delinquency of the poor, which has been the pattern of much of the last 65 years of international global governance. So the inclusion of developing countries in the oversight mechanisms and the inclusion of developed countries in the mechanisms that need to be overseen is essential as well. And to that I might add en passant the need for multilateral and regional development banks to have additional and adequate resources to fulfill their mandates. There's never good governance without good resources. Now, the need for increased, more democratic and more equitable global governance therefore cannot be denied. Jobs anywhere in the world today depend not only on local firms and factories, but on faraway markets for the goods they consume and produce, on licenses and access from foreign governments, on international financial trade rules that ensure the free movement of goods and persons, and on international financial institutions that ensure stability. In short, on the international system first constructed in 1945. We just have to bring them into the world of 2010. Our globalizing world clearly needs institutions and standards. not global government, for which there is little political support anywhere, but global governance built on laws and norms that countries negotiate together and agree to uphold as the common rules of the road. India is committed to a world in which sovereign states can come together to share burdens, address common problems, and seize common opportunities. If we are determined to live in a world governed by common rules and shared values, and to strengthen and reform the multilateral institutions that the enlightened leaders of the last century have bequeathed to us, then only can we fulfill the continuing adventure of making this century better than the last. At the same time, much of what we are in the process of accomplishing at home, to pull our people out of poverty and to develop our nation, enables us to contribute to a better world. This is a value in itself, and it's also in our fundamental national interest. A world that is peaceful and prosperous, where trade is free and universally agreed principles are observed, and in which democracy and respect for human rights flourish, is a world of opportunity for India and for Indians to thrive. As you know, we in India come from a very long tradition of internationalism or universalism. The old Sanskrit saying, Vasudevaya Kutumbakam, the whole world is one family, has animated India's approach since time immemorial on the global stage. We have never been an insular, internally focused country. We have always had an external focus. Even at the moment of independence in 1947, that midnight moment when the flames of partition with Pakistan were burning, our great first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was still able to speak not only of his dreams for India, but for the world. In his historic speech about India's tryst with destiny, Nehruji, speaking of our country's hopes, said, and I quote, "Those dreams are for India, but they are also for the world. For all the nations and peoples are too closely knit together today for any one of them to imagine that it can live apart. Peace has been said to be indivisible. So is freedom, so is prosperity now, and so also is disaster in this one world that can no longer be split into isolated fragments." Unquote. 63 years ago, he said that. So we see ourselves very consciously as a responsible international citizen seeking to help fulfill those dreams for the world. On that basis, we wish to see a world that is more equitable, that allows more voices to be heard, that allows more players to have a part in that classic spirit of Vasudevaya Kutumbakam, that we are all one family, and we have to sort out that family's business together. Thank you very much, and Jai Hind.